Hello, I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is Political Science 201, and this is video lecture number 6. All right, in video lecture number 5, we finished writing the Constitution. We talked very quickly about the conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over the lack of a Bill of Rights. That conflict was resolved. Sorry, I've got the hiccups. It was resolved when the Federalists gave their word that as soon as the first Congress met, that they would in fact support the creation of a Bill of Rights. So now, the document is sent out to the 13 states to be ratified or not. Let me spoil the story for you and tell you that all 13 of the states eventually ratify the Constitution. Some were a little slower than others, but they all eventually ratified. Many of the smaller states, and let me make it very clear what my definition is of a smaller state. It has nothing to do with the physical size of a state. It has everything to do with the population of a state. So we're talking about places like Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Those were among the small states, the low population states. In order to go into effect, the Constitution required that at least 9 of the 13 states ratify. Well, New Hampshire, as it turned out, was in fact the 9th state to ratify. They ratified in June of 1788. So, with the ratification of the Constitution by New Hampshire, everyone knew that the Articles of Confederation were dead, and that the Constitution would replace the old Articles of Confederation. Now, that leaves 4 states that had not ratified. One of those states was the state of Virginia. Virginia was had the most people of any of the 13 states. New York was one of those 4. It had the 3rd largest population. And geographically, it was critical because New York divided New England. It separated New England from the states that were further south. So Virginia and New York were absolutely critical for the survival of the new nation. Well, Virginia was won over by the promise of an immediate addition of the Bill of Rights. So we have 10 now who have ratified. New York, when New York realized that the Constitution was going to go into effect with or without them, they also ratified. Even though it was a close vote, New York ratified the Constitution. So now 11 of the 13 have ratified. North Carolina held out ratification. They didn't believe anything that anybody said. They wanted. Their attitude was, let's wait and see if they're going to keep their promises. North Carolina held out until after the Bill of Rights was actually written and submitted by the Congress to the states for ratification. And when that happened, North Carolina ratified the Constitution. So there you have 12. Rhode Island was the last one to ratify. They held out until 1790 before they ratified. And then they ratified by the closest of all margins, 2 votes. Now, let me explain that 2-vote margin. That wasn't 2 votes out of thousands. When I say that the states ratified the Constitution, what I really mean is that the legislatures of the states ratified the Constitution. wasn't the people, the great mass of people did not have a vote in this. And so when I say that the Constitution was ratified in Rhode Island by a margin of 2 votes, that's really a margin of 2 votes in the state legislature. Okay, so, but now we have all 13 states have eventually ratified. And there was a plan for the transition from operating under the Articles of Confederation to operating under the Constitution. There was a plan that was in place. They were simply waiting for that ninth state, which, as it turned out, was New Hampshire. They were waiting for that to happen. The old Articles of Confederation stayed in existence long enough to choose New York City as the first capital of the nation that had been created under the Constitution. And on October the 10th, 1788, magically, the the nation called the United States that had operated under the Articles of Confederation came to an end, and this new nation, also called the United States of America, that was operating under the Constitution, it came into existence. All right, let's talk about America, early national America. It is true uh, that the new nation under the Constitution didn't come into existence till 1788, but that's a sort of an odd day. We Americans, we like nice even numbers. Pardon me, my allergies are getting worse and worse and worse, and I apologize uh, for my disgusting noises on video number 5 and now on video number 6, but there's very little I can do about it except complain, okay, and ask for your forgiveness. All right. The United States, according to the Constitution, uh, conducts a census every 10 years. The first census was conducted in the year 1790, and a census has been conducted every year since then. Now, let's be very careful here. The Constitution didn't say that the first uh, census would be conducted in 1790. It just simply said you'll conduct a census, right? And and it didn't, the Constitution didn't care what year the first census was conducted. But what it said was that once you conduct that first one, you've got to do one every 10 years after that. Well, they decided to do the first one in 1790 because that means that after that, every census would be conducted in a year divisible by 10. 1800, 1810, 1820, 1830. We did a census this year because 2020 is divisible by 10. All right. And so the numbers I'm going to give you are based on the first census, that census of 1790. All right. In that year, the boundaries, the east and west boundaries of the United States, uh, the eastern boundary was the Atlantic Ocean, obviously. The western boundary was the Mississippi River. The northern boundary was the southern boundary of Canada, and we mentioned this was an issue that had not been resolved yet because uh, no one actually knew where the southern boundary of Canada was. They knew they were pretty close, but nobody could put their finger on the ground and say, this is the dividing line between Canada and the United States. But nevertheless, generally, the northern boundary of the United States was the southern boundary of Canada. And as we have also said before, the southern boundary of the United States did not, as it does today, go to the Gulf of Mexico. It stopped at the northern boundary of Spanish Florida. Only later, after the United States buys Florida from Spain, does the United States go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay. it was a big country. It was larger than most European countries. And of course, we know that it's going to get larger as time passes. There were about 4 million people living in the United States in the year 1790. Of those 4 million, about 750,000 of them were African. And the vast majority of the 750,000 Africans were slaves. So it was, you do the math, it was about 20%. About 20% of the total United States population in 1790 consisted of African slaves. Now, the percentage today in 2020 is about 13%. So, when expressed as a percentage of the total population, there were more slaves in the United States in 1790 than there are now. Right? 20% and then about 13% now. Oh, are you aware? You know, for years and years and years, African Americans were the largest uh, ethnic minority in the United States. But as a result of the 2010 census, Hispanics are now the second largest. Of course, Caucasians, the largest, followed by now Hispanics and then African Americans. Now, we also said, and I stated this very strongly so you would understand, that slavery existed in all 13 of the original states. But we also said that most of those slaves lived in the South. Only about 10% of the slaves lived outside the South. The United States in 1790 was a predominantly rural society. Even the towns that were called cities at that time, very few of them had more than 10,000 population. Even places like New York and Philadelphia had fewer than 10,000 people. So today, those cities would be considered towns, wouldn't they? Most Americans lived in the rural areas of the country. Now, that census, by the way, did not count American Indians. Uh, and there were significant numbers of American Indians who were living within the boundaries of the United States in 1790. We guess, because we couldn't count them, I mean, who had the nerve to go into an Indian village and count people? They might get scalped or worse. Uh, well, we think that as many as 150,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi River. Now, most of the people, black and white, who lived in the United States in 1790 lived east of the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians generally served as the true western border of the United States. Uh, Only about 125,000 people, white and black, lived west of the Appalachian Mountains in 1790. The United States was already sort of dividing itself into three main geographical areas. And you probably learned this in sixth, seventh grade history. The New England states, the middle states, the southern states. Well, New England was an area of small farms and very busy seaports. In New England, you had places like Boston, right? Newport News in Rhode Island. Uh, New England was right on the edge of beginning to develop small scale manufacturing, little factories. It was pretty primitive from our way of thinking, but it was very modern according to their way of thinking. Uh, the New England soil was notoriously poor. It was rocky. Uh, Families were fortunate enough. They were fortunate if they could grow enough food for their own needs in that poor New England, rocky, stony soil. And for as a result, New England was never dependent upon large scale agriculture, for example, like the South and parts of the Middle States were. New England very early began to, it sounds odd to say it, but the ocean became the farms of the New England states. Fishing was so very important to the New England economy, and things that are associated with fishing, like fishing boats and masts and sails and barrels in which to store the salted fish. If it was related to the fishing industry, it probably was happening in New England. Now, uh, let's skip the Middle States. I'm going to come back to it for a reason that will become obvious to you in just a moment. Let's skip over to the Southern states. The Southern states uh, were the most agricultural. All of the states, to one degree or another, were agricultural states, including New England, if you considered fish to be a crop. Right? Uh, the South was a diverse agricultural place. They grew a lot of different crops: indigo, tobacco, grain such as wheat, corn. They grew hemp. Uh, Hemp was used back in those days to make organic rope, and of course, marijuana is related to to hemp as well. So I guess uh, if they had known back then that that was true, they might have tried to legalize it and sell it. Uh, you notice that I did not mention cotton as one of the crops of the southern states, and there's a real good reason for that. In 1790, cotton was not an important crop. Cotton, uh, in order to uh, use the fiber of cotton in order to spin it and make thread and weave clothing, uh, you've got to separate the cotton seed from the cotton fiber. And men had been trying to invent a machine that would do that for a long time, and no one had ever come up with a working one. And so, if you wanted to use cotton for to make fabric, you had to literally separate by hand the cotton seed from the cotton fiber. And as a result, what is the first law of economics? The more scarce a thing is, the more it's going to cost. Cotton fabric was very scarce because it was very labor intensive, and as a result, it was very expensive, and only the wealthy could afford cotton. Now, I'm sitting here at my kitchen table creating this lecture for you tonight, and everything I have on, I think, is made of cotton. My shirt, what you can't see is that I have my PJ bottoms on, made of cotton. My underwear, cotton. My socks, cotton. The only thing I have on that's not cotton are my bedroom slippers made of leather. Cotton would, in just a few years, become extraordinarily important to the Southern economy, but not in 1790. Not yet. Okay. So why did I leave the Middle States for to be examined last? Because the Middle States, pardon me, the Middle States reflected some of the characteristics of New England, and they reflected some of the characteristics of the Southern states. For example, uh, in some parts of the Middle States, which included the state of New York, and Pennsylvania, there were some huge farms that were so big that they could have been considered to be plantations. Uh, Many parts of of the middle states had rich, deep topsoil. They could grow almost anything. They were really limited. The only limitation they had was the winter. The An early winter could kill the crops, right? A late winter could prevent the crops from being next year's crops from being planted. But nevertheless, the middle states reflected characteristics of both of the other areas. Now, let's get back to the politics for just a moment. The the first elections for president, vice president, members of the House, members of the Senate, all those took place late in 1788, and the winners were sworn in spring of 1789 in the new capital of New York City. George Washington was elected to be the first president of the United States, and John Adams, uh, who had the second highest number of votes, was sworn in as Washington's vice president. Washington was a really reluctant president. You know, people today, all they want to ever accomplish is to be president. That is the culmination of a life's dream, is to become the president of the United States. Washington really did not want to be president, and it was not false modesty. He really, I mean, think of all that Washington had accomplished in his life. Uh, well, first of all, he married the richest widow in Virginia. Martha was rich, rich, rich. Washington didn't have to work a day in his life if he had not wanted to, but he did want to his credit. He had served as an officer in the colonial Virginia militia. He had served as the uh, commander in chief. He had fought in the French and Indian War on the side of the British. He had served as the commander in chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He had served as the moderator at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. So, Washington, uh, his lifetime accomplishments, that list was rather long and very much impressive. At this stage in his life, all Washington wanted to do was to go home and to retire and grow tobacco and distill rum. What many of my students are surprised to hear is that George Washington was the biggest distiller of alcoholic hard liquor of anybody in the nation. He made whiskey by the barrel and rum by the barrel, and became a very rich man on his own. Didn't need his wife's money. He became rich on his own. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to retire, go back home and raise tobacco and make whiskey and rum. Well, the country would not permit him to do that. The word wasn't used, but the word that we would use today to describe what happened to Washington, he was drafted. The people, there was only one person that most Americans could envision as president, and that was Washington. And because Washington was uh, loyal to his nation uh, and a man of honor, he reluctantly became president and served 2 terms. Washington could have been, I'm convinced that Washington could have served a 3rd term had he chosen to, but he did not want to. Near the end of his 2nd term, he made it very clear to anybody who cared to listen to him that at the end of that second term, don't even ask me for a third term. I'm going home. And they honored his wishes. He was a reluctant president. But Washington was exactly what the nation needed at that time. He was sober. He was moderate. Washington was not a genius like a Madison or an Adams, but he had different qualities that were just as necessary in those first years of the Republic operating under the Constitution. Remember that everything that George Washington did as president was being done for the first time. He sort of set the standard. He created the model for future presidents. He literally kept the new nation from disintegrating. You don't hear him referred to as the father of his country too much anymore, and that's a shame because he was. When I was in grade school, it was understood that George Washington was, in fact, the father of his country. And I would go as far as to say that had Washington not been the president, the country would have probably collapsed. Because, but it didn't, because of the wise decisions that Washington made. Now, uh, Washington created his cabinet very early in his presidency. He nominated Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State, the first one. He nominated Alexander Hamilton to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. He nominated Edmund Randolph to be the first Attorney General. And those are all three cabinet level positions. He also, this is not a cabinet level position, it requires nomination and approval by the Senate. Nevertheless, he nominated John Jay to be the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Uh, the Federalists kept their promise as soon as that first Congress met. Once everybody was sworn in and everyone had, once everyone was in their seats, among the first orders of business was the creation of a Bill of Rights. Um, let's talk about the Bill of Rights a little bit before we go forward. We mentioned earlier that the rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights are not social rights, they are political rights. Uh, and those protections that are provided by the Bill of Rights are very precious to Americans. And, we can all name at least some of them, free, freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion and all those things, right? Those are political rights. And who does the Bill of Rights protect us from? And many of my students are always surprised when I tell them that the Bill of Rights was designed to protect us from our own government. Let me say that again. Close your mouths, okay? I know you're in shock. It was designed to protect us from our own government. Now, why do I say that? Well, many of you are thinking right now, "Oh, Dr. Taylor, that's ridiculous. Uh, uh, our government would never ever try to take away our rights." Well, in the year 1789, a government had already tried to take away our rights. That government was the British government back when we were still British citizens. I'm sorry, British subjects. But they did try to take away our rights, didn't they? That was the cause, pardon me, of the American Revolution. So don't tell me that the government can't try to take away your rights. Uh, and the people who wrote the Bill of Rights, most of them had lived through the American Revolution, and they knew what the British had tried to do. And so this was, when we talk about the Bill of Rights, that's something that happened more than 200 years ago. But when these people talked about the Bill of Rights, it was a uh, recent memory for them. They had lived through this. And so they wanted to make sure that the government would never, ever try to take away the rights that God had given. Okay, a minute while I find my place. Okay. All right. At this point, 30 minutes into this lecture, we are finally going to get into the content of the Constitution itself. All right. Here on to the end of the term, we'll be talking about the U.S. Constitution. Now, but before we do that, we've got to talk about how the Constitution is designed. All right. Uh, the Constitution is, many of you in junior high school and high school learned how to make outlines, right? Before you write the term paper, you've got to make an outline, right? Remember that? Remember how frustrating that used to be? The Roman numerals and the big letters and the little bitty letters. Oh, okay, that's what I'm talking about, an outline. The large uh, topics of the Constitution are referred to as articles. Those articles are further divided into sections. The sections are further divided into smaller groups called paragraphs, and the paragraphs are further divided into smaller, even smaller sections called clauses. Right? Articles, sections, paragraphs, clauses. The introduction to the Constitution doesn't fall into any of those categories. It is what it is. It is an introduction. As a matter of fact, they don't call it introduction. They call it by a fancier academic name. It's called the Preamble. The Preamble to the Constitution. The Preamble sets out the purpose of the Constitution. Now, what I'm going to do, starting with the Preamble, I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go back and we are going to break the preamble up into its constituent parts. And I will explain, hopefully, it in its entirety. And I'll do that for the entire Constitution. So let's start with the preamble. I'm going to read the whole thing first. And these are some of the most famous words in American history. Many of you, at some point in your academic life, were required to memorize the preamble to the Constitution. All right, here we go. The preamble to the United States Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The preamble sets out the purposes of the Constitution. It lists them. First of all, who is responsible for the creation of the Constitution according to the preamble? And for whom was the Constitution written? It's we the people. It doesn't say we the king, we the nobles, we the wealthy, we the big shots, we the elites. It doesn't say that at all. It says we the people. And not just the people, but a specific group of people. We the people of the United States. Uh, there are debates today over whether illegal aliens, who by their very nature are in the country illegally, right? It is a debate today about whether they are entitled to the rights, the constitutional rights of someone who was born in the United States. And that issue is still being argued, so we don't know how that's going to be resolved. But personally, I think that the benefits of the Constitution should be reserved for for people who are actual United States citizens. Now, maybe I'm wrong. We, the people of the United States. Okay, here we go. Here are the reasons why this thing is being written. In order to form a more perfect union, that's one of the reasons why it's written, to form a more perfect union. Now, folks, if your goal is to create a more perfect union, then it's logical to assume that what you had before was a less perfect union, right? And what and that's exactly what we had. What was that less perfect union? What was the document that created that less perfect union? And the answer is the Articles of Confederation. So right here in the preamble, they are admitting the weaknesses. They're not specific, but they are admitting that the previous document was less perfect and it needed to be replaced. To establish justice. You know, one of the complaints that Jefferson voiced in the Declaration of Independence was that the British, who had said that the colonists were Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen, the British were not keeping that promise. They were treating the colonists, differently than they were treating Englishmen who lived in England. And they were moving trials to Canada. In other words, they were moving into another country. Uh, Justice cannot exist in conditions like that. And the Constitution mentions that. One of the purposes of the Constitution is to establish justice. Now, was the justice that was created really fair? Was it really justice? And I say no, no, it wasn't. Because I mean, that sounds great, doesn't it? Oh, we're going to establish justice. But justice for who? And the answer is justice for adult white males. Uh, Africans, there was no justice for Africans. They were slaves, for goodness sake. There was very little justice for women, which comprised half the population. There was certainly no justice for the American Indians who had been here for thousands of years before the first European ever stepped on shore. So, uh, this is a high sounding phrase to establish justice, uh, but it would take a couple of hundred years to approach what we have today, which is a lot closer to true justice. And yet, there are those who say we still have not achieved true justice. We still discriminate against certain people groups based on the color of their skin, their religion, their socioeconomic status, things like that. But even if we have not achieved it, it is a noble goal to ensure domestic tranquility. What in the world is domestic tranquility? Well, the idea uh, that Americans can depend on their government to guarantee their God-given rights. Remember what Jefferson said. We must remember this. Jefferson said that man cannot give rights to other men. that rights come from Almighty God, and that the main purpose of government is to make sure that those God-given rights uh, exist. They're not taken away by other men. To provide for the common defense. Well, I think that's sort of self-evident. There are certain things that individual people can do. There are certain things that small towns can do. There are certain things that it takes a larger group, like perhaps a state, to accomplish. But there are other things that only the national government is big enough to do. One of them is to defend us from our outside enemies. And so, this is included in the preamble to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare. This is another area in which the language is very noble sounding language, but many people say that we still have not achieved uh, uh, the general welfare. Now, let's define that word welfare for just a moment. In the modern sense, welfare might be considered to be help from the government, right? He's on welfare. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the government giving help to certain people. We're talking about something that's more noble than that. That Americans, as a group, feel that we are a special people, that we have been blessed by God, that it's our destiny to provide an example to the rest of the world of how to conduct our political affairs, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, what is posterity? Well, that's our descendants. That's our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren. That's our posterity. So, what the preamble says is that the purpose for which it's being written, is not just for the generation that was alive when the Constitution was written. No, it was meant to last a long time, and that future generations, our posterity, would would recognize the advantages and the blessings of liberty. And for all of those reasons, we have ordained and established this Constitution for the United States of America. Okay, now the that outline that I mentioned to you earlier comes into play. Now, let me stop here and tell you that in my normal classes, in my face-to-face classes, I require each student to have a copy of the Constitution. I don't care what the format is. You can have it. They make these little pamphlets that contain the Constitution. Uh, you have the textbook for the political science class. I can almost guarantee you that the Constitution is in the back of the book, along with the Declaration and probably the Articles of Confederation. Uh, and normally, I will just randomly one day walk into class and I will say, "Everybody, show me your copy of the Constitution." And if you can't show it to me, I ask you to leave. Well, I can't do that, right? Teaching online. But let me encourage you, nevertheless, to get yourself a copy of the Constitution and follow along with me as we go through it. Now, the bookstore has a really neat, uh, there's a rack in the bookstore, and on that rack are copies of the Constitution that are oh, what do you call it when it's wrapped in plastic? Well, shucks. Anyway, you can buy those things. It's $2 or $3. Uh, and it's indestructible. It will last forever. Your children will be using that copy of the Constitution. It's hole punched already, and it'll fit right into your binder, and it'll always be with you. I suggest that whether you get that one or some other format, get a copy of the Constitution because that is your textbook for the remainder of the semester. The textbook that you picked up from the rental bookstore, we're not going to use it unless you use the Constitution that's in the back. You can use it as a doorstop if you want to. Hide it in your underwear drawer. Hide it somewhere. Don't forget where it is because you got to turn the silly thing back at the end of the semester. But we will not be using it unless it's that part of it that is the Constitution. Okay. Here we are. Article 1. Not just Article 1, but Article 1, Section 1. The very beginning of the Constitution after the preamble ends. Article 1, Section 1 says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. And that's one sentence, but that one sentence is packed with information. Okay, the first thing it tells you, it says all legislative powers are, and I'm gonna take some of these old-fashioned words and I'm going to translate them into modern words. Okay, what it says is all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. What does that mean? That's old-fashioned. That's 1700s language. All ability to make laws. That's what a legislative power is. All of the ability to make laws will be given to the Congress. In other words, only the Congress can make laws. The president cannot make laws. The Supreme Court, the federal courts cannot make laws. Only the Congress can make laws. I apologize for being so disgusting. There's not much I can do about it, though. Now, the president can assist unofficially in making laws, but the Congress has every right. If the president tries to interfere, Congress has every right to tell the president, respectfully, please, right? Respectfully. Mr. President, this is not your job. This is our job. You need to go back to the White House and do your job and let us do our job. Right? Only the Congress can make laws. Now, the president has a role eventually, doesn't he? Because when the bill is sent to his desk, he then has the power to veto it or to approve it. But while it's being created, that's really not his job. So, all power to make laws shall be given to the Congress of the United States. And then it defines the characteristics of the Congress. It says, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. So, what it says is, the Congress has the power to make laws, and the Congress will be a bicameral Congress composed of two chambers, the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1. This section of the Constitution talks about just the House of Representatives. Later, it'll talk just about the Senate. But starting in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1, Oh, by the way, on quizzes and exams, I will never ask you, the question will never be, what is the content of Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1? I'll never ask you that type of question. What I will ask you is a question concerning the material that's contained within Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1. Okay, so if you're concerned about that I would do that, you can let that concern rest. I'm not going to do that to you. All right. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1 says the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Now, that sounds really complicated, but it's not, because I'm going to break it down and put it into modern language for you. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year. So that tells you what the term of office, the normal term of office, is for a member of the House of Representatives. They have to run for re-election every 2 years. And they will be chosen every 2 years by the people of the several states. Now, today, the word several generally means 3 or more. Okay, if you've got a couple of students, that's 2. But if you've got several students, that's 3 or more. But that word several here doesn't mean 3 or more. It's an old-fashioned word that means individual. So let's substitute the word individual for the word several here, and it'll make a lot more sense. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the individual states. Okay? There it is. Individual states. And the electors. That's a confusing term because we have this thing called the Electoral College. That's not what this is talking about. I wish that they had used a different word here, but I can't go back and fuss at them because they've all been dead for 100 years plus. What this really means is the people who vote, those are the electors, all right? The House of Representatives, so let's read it and catch up. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the individual states, and the voters in each state shall have the qualifications required for voters of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So, what this is asking is what are the qualifications? What are our qualifications to be able to legally and constitutionally vote for members of the U.S. House of Representatives? And what is the answer? Well, you need to be qualified to vote for U.S. representative. You have to be qualified to vote for members of your state's House of Representatives. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's pick on Louisiana. Louisiana state government is very similar. The form of the Louisiana state government is very similar to the form of the United States government. Uh, we have an executive branch, except we don't call the top guy the president. We call him the governor, but it's still the executive branch at the state level. We got a lieutenant governor. Uh, we have a legislative branch here, and in Louisiana we call it the legislature. And in Louisiana, it is a bicameral legislature. We have a Louisiana Senate and a Louisiana House of Representatives, and we have a Louisiana court system that is very similar to the United States federal court system. Supreme Court, courts of appeal, state district courts. So very, very similar. Now, what the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1 It's asking the question, who elects members of the United States House of Representatives? And the answer is, if you, as a citizen, are qualified to vote in your state for your members, your state members of the state House of Representatives, then you are also qualified to vote for the national House of Representatives. All right, let's read that whole thing again. The neat thing about these taped lectures is that you can go back and listen to them over and over and over again until you get it. Paragraph 1 says, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the individual states. And the voters, and to be qualified to vote for members of the House of Representatives, you must also be qualified to vote for your state members of your state House of Representatives. So it sounds rather complicated, but it really isn't once you get past that 18th century language. All right, section 2. No, paragraph 2. Paragraph 2. No person, okay, now paragraph 2 talks about the qualifications to be a member of the United States House of Representatives. Okay, here are the qualifications. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years. Okay, let's stop right there. You got to be 25 years of age to be a minimum of 25 years of age to be a U.S. representative. Now, let's be picky here. You can be 24 when you run. You can even be 24 when you're elected. But on the day that you're sworn in, you must be 25 years old. Okay, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States. So here's the question. Can you be born in another country, come to the United States, legally become a citizen? Once you do that, can you become a member of the House of Representatives? And the answer is yes. But you've got to be, once you become a citizen, you have to have been a citizen for 7 years before you become eligible to run for the House of Representatives. And so you got to be 25 on the day you're sworn in. On the day that you're sworn in, you have to have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. And the last qualification is you've got to live in the state that elects you.